The Clemson Tigers lose to the Florida State Seminoles, their hated in-conference rival, at home for the first time since 2013, when Jameis Winston and a Florida State team that eventually won the national title came into Death Valley and dominated. Statistically, there's an argument that Clemson dominated the game on Saturday. After all, the Tigers had 34 minutes and 36 seconds of possession. They outgained Florida State by over 100 yards, gaining 429 total yards while holding the Seminoles to only 311. And Clemson had 25 first downs to Florida State's 16. Clemson had more success on third down efficiency, and they had the same success, 500, on fourth down efficiency. The Tigers also averaged 3.6 yards per rush and had almost 150 rushing yards while holding Florida State to 22 rushing yards on 20 attempts. So, why did Clemson lose this game? And let alone, how did this game even get to overtime with those statistical inequalities? With Clemson, looking at the stat sheet, dominating this game. Well, I was watching Michigan and Rutgers and paying attention to that game more than this one because I primarily cover the Big Ten, but I had this game on my secondary TV. And I went back, watched some highlights packages, and, exchanged text messages with my friend, Markishimo, who previewed this game with me last week. And despite the fact that Clemson at times was dominating the lines of scrimmage and that their defense really came to play and shut down Florida State's primary mode or desired mode of attack, which is the ground game. That's what Florida State wants to get going. Ultimately, some inexperience and injuries at the secondary allowed Jordan Travis and Florida State to pass downfield, deep, and Clemson had problems with turnovers and fundamental football, and they themselves had their own problems in the trenches. Clemson was up 24-17, and they were driving in Florida State territory. Phil Mafah had a long run. Mafah actually led the Tigers in rushing yards that day, this past Saturday. He had a long rush of 46. He had 10 carries for 69 total yards, and he had 32 yards receiving. Phil Mafah's a great number 2 option behind Will Shipley. Clemson's ultimate strength on their offense is their run game. But what happened was Florida State sends a blitz. I think they send like 6 guys forward. And Kalen DeLoach is unblocked, and I'm pretty sure that Phil Mafah was assigned to block him. Cade Klubnik doesn't see the blitz coming, and DeLoach just, wrecks him. Just like a bus hitting a horse. Boom. Ball comes out. DeLoach and Braden Fisk are trying to get the ball. Fisk luckily doesn't pick it up because he's slower. Probably wouldn't have returned it for 6, even though there was a pathway clear for him to get there. DeLoach ends up picking it up with a convoy of blockers in front of him. He returns it, and Clemson's entire crowd is stunned. And if you are a Clemson fan, I imagine that you are stunned that this game was lost. Also, there were a few other plays where Florida State and their defensive coordinator, Adam Fuller, sent forward blitz packages, and Klubnik and his offensive line and running backs, if they were assigned blockers, didn't pick up on the blitzes, but due to Garrett Riley's scheming, Klubnik was able to get the ball off just in time. Florida State was applying pressure throughout the day. The Seminoles were able to get successfully to Klubnik multiple times. They had 3 sacks, 6 tackles for loss, 7 passes defended, and of course they had that 1 defensive touchdown by Kalen DeLoach. And Florida State did not play a perfect game by any stretch of the imagination. They didn't, and neither did Clemson. But at the end of the day, Florida State played more sound fundamental football. They had the better kicker, they had the better special teams, and I'd say on average, at the end of the day, they had the better trench play. I think that Clemson had the better performing run game and rushing attack, but Florida State had the better pass protection, and their defensive line and their defense really at the end of the day are the reason why they won this game. Holding Clemson to 24 points while the offense, the running backs, while Trey Benson and even Jordan Travis at times sputtered, the defense kept Florida State within striking distance and ultimately gave the Seminoles the defensive touchdown that sent this game into overtime. And here is where I think this is the embodiment of Clemson. This is the epitome of Clemsoning, which is now returned, I think, officially. Clemsoning, by the way, is Clemson making a fool out of themselves. It was a term that was used, I know, over a decade ago, early in Dabo Swinney's tenure. I think it's returned here. 3rd and inches. You have ran the ball all day. This is an overtime. Florida State's up 31-24 after Keon Coleman has an amazing 24-yard reception, one-on-one from Jordan Travis. Keon Coleman's a phenomenal player. Johnny Wilson is a great wide receiver, but I think Keon Coleman is the best wide receiver on the team. But to get back on topic, Clemson and Cade Klubnik made this decision. Instead of running the football, instead of handing it off to his running back, Cade Klubnik instead throws a screen pass. And Florida State's defensive backs are all over it. They tackle the wide receiver for a loss. It's 4th and 2. And once again, Clemson, you've been running it all day. It's 4th and 2. I know that Florida State is going to be aggressive, but you've been able to run it with whether it's Will Shipley or Phil Maffa or even Cade Klubnik himself. It's 4th and 2, but I imagine Clemson could have ran it up the middle on 4th and 2 and converted it. Instead, once again, they pass, and it doesn't work. Game over, 31-24. Clemson, to their credit, ran the football more than they passed it. They had 41 carries, 38 pass attempts. Florida State passed far more than they rushed. They had 37 passing attempts in comparison to only 20 carries on the ground. But the ground game very early was being snuffed out by Clemson's defense, and specifically by Clemson's front 4 and front 7. So Clemson they made mistakes. They didn't read the room and read the field right, in my mind, when it mattered most, whether it's on, pass blocking and protecting Cade Klubnik, or Cade Klubnik and Garrett Riley's decision-making and play calling. All in all, Florida State, they outcoached Clemson, and they also outplayed Clemson, at least in part of not making simple mistakes and of just running the game right and sticking to fundamentals. Clemson, I was impressed with their wide receiver play, given how poor it's been over the past 3 games before Saturday's matchup, and Clemson no doubt had the better ground game. I think that's something Florida State is going to have to pay attention to and work on, especially if they want to win a college football playoff game, if they want to go undefeated. With how Travis and the wide receivers and the passing offense has been playing, you need to have that option to run. You have to. And it's been a consistent factor now for 4 games that Florida State has had problems running the football. My player of the game is Kalen DeLoach. Linebacker, 7 total tackles, a sack, a forced fumble, and a touchdown. Without DeLoach picking up that fumble and returning it for 6, there's a good chance that Clemson wins this game. Right before DeLoach had his strip sack and fumble recovery for a touchdown, Clemson had an 83.8% chance of winning this game the play before. After his fumble recovery, it jumped up to 51.6% in Clemson's favor. Florida State, they held Clemson's offense to nothing, and then Clemson on special teams wasn't able to execute at the end of the day. They had a kicker who kicked his first career field goal in Jonathan Wheats. He had a long of 30 that he made, and then he had, I think, a shorter field goal or a field goal of similar distance that he hooked to his left. Very painful for him, obviously. That was his moment to be, the hero, and it didn't work. So I feel bad for him, really. Tried his best. He, I think, was formerly recruited by Clemson, but then he ended up going on to graduate school, and he still had eligibility. So they brought him back. He's been on the team and has kicked extra points for Clemson since 2020. I don't know much about him, so pardon me if I'm, kind of searching around for information about him during this live. But he made a field goal, he missed another, and ultimately you cannot blame the loss whatsoever on him. You blame it on the protection and also, I would say, the game plan overall for Florida State. Florida State, on the other hand, I know that defensive coordinator Adam Fuller has received a lot of heat from the fan base. I know that, my Florida State friend of mine, Marcus, who I've mentioned earlier in this video, I know that he has told me that Adam Fuller is, not a great defensive coordinator, not an elite defensive coordinator. And I certainly agree with him. I think an elite defensive coordinator probably would have done a much better job containing Clemson's offense. Clemson nearly had, 450 yards of total offense. That's a lot. And they also scored 24 points in regulation. I think with the talent on Florida State's defense, an elite defensive coordinator certainly could have limited Clemson's offense to scoring, 7, 10, maybe boldly I say 14 less points than they did in regulation. But nonetheless, at the end of the day, he did his job. His defense got a fumble recovery. They had 3 sacks. They were applying pressure. And even though Clemson's rushing offense was more successful than Florida State's, they only averaged 3.6 yards per carry, and they had 41 rushing attempts. So the run defense wasn't awful. I think it needs work, but more so it was Florida State's rush offense that, in my mind, had the black eye given to them. Only 22 rushing yards on 20 attempts is just, you cannot have that. But going back to Kalen DeLoach, who again is my player of the game, phenomenal play. He had a few other blitz packages where I think on one play specifically, he was on Klubnik's left side and he came unprotected and Klubnik just barely got it off. I'm pretty sure that was Kalen DeLoach coming on that blitz, but he had several pressures, made several plays, and again, having 7 total tackles on the day and having that touchdown is impressive. And the sack, he also had a pass defended, and on the season so far, he's had 17 total tackles, a pass defended, 3 sacks, a forced fumble, and obviously that touchdown that he returned after forcing the fumble. He's a senior, 6'1", 212 pounds from Savannah, Georgia, number 4 for Florida State. And I have to say that the linebacker core stepped up, and even though the secondary at times made Clemson's receivers look better than I think they actually are, I think some of that's just due to play calling, the defense did its job. When you allow your opponent to get 100 more yards than you, over 400 yards, and yet hold them to 24 points, and even score some points for your offense while they're having their own problems to work through, I'd say that's important. That shows that the defense can keep Florida State in games and potentially win them games. Because Jordan Travis struggled to complete 50% of his passes. Benson and the run game and the offensive line when it came to run blocking struggled to get going. It was really Keon Coleman and Jordan Travis and also Johnny Wilson that were, picking Florida State up and continuing to move them through this game. Johnny Wilson and Keon Coleman had 10 combined receptions, and combined in total yards, they had 180 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. They averaged over 17 yards per reception each. Trey Benson, he had 3 receptions for 50 yards, and he had a long of 29, which was just a beautiful touch pass by Jordan Travis there. And that was deep in their own territory, and Benson helped get them out of that. So Kalen DeLoach is my player of the game. I think that Keon Coleman certainly could have been nominated. He scored 2 of Florida State's 3 offensive touchdowns, and he finished the day with 86 receiving yards on 5 receptions with a long of 38. And he did catch Florida State's lone touchdown pass in overtime. It was a 24-yard pass from Jordan Travis. Keon Coleman so far has been Florida State's best wide receiver. I like him a lot. I liked him when he was at Michigan State. And right now he has 6 receiving touchdowns and 256 receiving yards on the year. 6'4", 215, big-bodied wide receiver who can run routes, is disciplined, and is lethal in one-on-one situations. So Keon Coleman, Kalen DeLoach, and then Jordan Travis, too, for making the throws. Florida State has plenty of playmakers. And then defensively, we all know the names of, Fentrell Cypress and Jared Verse and also Braden Fisk and many others. This Florida State team is very talented, and I'll give them all the praise, and we'll talk more about them in a few minutes. But I want to talk about Clemson, purely Clemson, first. On this show, we talk about the winners last. We save the best for last. And we get to the losers, and we talk about the worst first. The Tigers have severe issues with fundamental football. I cannot stress this enough. How many times do you have to turn over the football? And do you have to run your offense in an awkward way before you think to yourself, oh, maybe we should adapt our scheme? Dabo Swinney just keeps hearkening on, it's turnovers. And I understand that, Garrett Riley, he's in year one, and he's bringing a new offense here. But you can tweak the offense to maximize strengths, and you can bring in, extra blockers to help protect Cade Klubnik. You can, draw up a different game plan. You can make better decisions on downs, assess the situation. You can do so many different things. And the same goes defensively as well. There are many changes that can be made. Football is, fundamentals, trench play, special teams, it's passing the football, it's running the football. You can boil football down to a lot of simple things, and the way to win in football to a certain degree is very simple, but there are a lot of intricacies and complexities that you can change and that you can, have different game plans, one for every separate team on your 12-game schedule. And Clemson right now, they turn over the football. They don't read the room or observe the field right, in my mind, whether it's offensively or defensively. Quarterback play is sloppy. They don't have any elite players at all, whether defensively or offensively. I think they have the potential in some of those rooms, whether it's the defensive line, for example, with guys like, Peter Woods, or, for example, other players like Jeremiah Trotter or Tyler Davis, and then offensively, maybe Will Shipley. They have a handful of players with elite potential, but right now none of them are elite, and even if they were, it's just a handful of players. Clemson clearly is being hurt by issues relating to depth, and more importantly, develop and also schematics. Dabo Swinney needs to evolve. He needs to. Because yes, Clemson can, win 10 or 9 or maybe sometimes 11 or 12 games with what they're doing right now. They totally can. They still, by the blue chip ratio, are the most talented team in the ACC. By a mile. Like Florida State, if you look at high school recruiting rankings, and even if you factor in the transfer portal, Florida State's not even close in terms of talent. But Florida State has a much better and superior coaching staff, and they've developed their players better. Florida State also has higher quality depth. They've used the portal to bring in guys who can win them games, who right now are backups or who are on the bench. The offensive line for Florida State has dealt with injuries, and they had players step up at offensive line in this game that, didn't play at a great or elite level, but they filled in and they helped this team win. Florida State has depth. Clemson, one of their star corners went down, and pardon me that I forget his name. I pray that he's healed and that he has a good rest of his football career. I hate seeing injuries. To talk about things from a purely, football and execution standpoint, that player gets injured. And Jaden Lucas was a highly rated corner, a defensive back, out of high school. And he's going to be a great corner, I think, as he grows and matures. Clemson has a starter go down. I kid you not, just a few plays later. and Jaden Lucas just gets torched by Keon Coleman. Now, maybe that's an unfair comparison, and of course, there's going to be some drop-off there, but depth is really hurting Clemson. I think that that's evident, and that's been evident for the past, I'd say, season, maybe seasons, but now it's really beginning to bite them in the butt. They typically sign smaller recruiting classes. It seems like in the past they've desired quality over quantity. Well, now you gotta have more quantity, and you also have to use the transfer portal for not just bringing in guys like Paul Tyson or Hunter Johnson to become graduate assistants as their quarterbacks who have no future in the NFL. You got to do something. You have to change after this game if you're Dabo Swinney. I know that overnight this won't happen, but there has to be a game plan heading into next season when the 12-team playoff comes around, and it will be easier than ever for Clemson to reach the playoff. There's got to be a plan to at least improve, reach the playoffs, hopefully win the conference. It's possible for Clemson to win out. They get Notre Dame at home. They get Miami at home. A lot of their tough games, North Carolina too, they face a lot of their tougher opponents at home, and they don't have to travel on the road to play much of anyone, at least in theory. But on paper at the beginning of the year, this team should have won on the road and beat Duke handily. I even picked them to do so foolishly. And instead Duke, the Blue Devils, typically known as a basketball school, beat them 28-7. So there are no more guaranteed wins on Clemson's schedule. They got dominated by Duke. Florida State beat them in overtime. That's going to be an emotional loss. And they've struggled at times, not for the whole game, but at times against even Charleston Southern and also Florida Atlantic, though at the end they did dominate those two teams. We'll have to see where this team goes. The defense, finally, total paper tiger. Whether it's against Duke, who manhandled them and eventually broke the defense, or it's Jordan Travis, Johnny Wilson, Keon Coleman, and Trey Benson through the air. This defense, when faced off against either a physical team or an offense that has capability to finesse and has great skill players, they will allow, I would say, anywhere from 20 to 30 points if they face an elite offense, like Washington, for example. Washington could totally hang 40 on this defense. They have a lot of great players, but I think Wes Goodwin and Mickey Kahn, and you saw that Dabo Swinney was getting frustrated at Wes Goodwin, the head guy of the defense. I don't think they can put their players in a position to win like Brent Venables could, and they can't develop at the same rate either. That's all I'm going to say about Clemson. They need to make change. In fact, they need to follow what Mike Norvell has done at Florida State. And this was going to be the talking point. Always was going to be. If Florida State came in and won this game, no matter by how much or how little, or whether it seemed to be a fluke or not, this was a program-defining game for both schools. Now, of course, I'm not saying Dabo Swinney has to abandon everything he knew. In fact, even if Clemson did win this game, I would still advise to use the portal and use NIL, because sooner rather than later, unless you are the exception to the rule, and that's very rare as it is, Deion Sanders is an example of this. He had an awesome post-game press conference after Oregon, and I'm curious to see how they do against USC. I think that might be a closer game than many anticipate, but this is a reaction video, not a preview video. I don't think Dabo Swinney's the exception to the rule, and with name, image, and likeness and the transfer portal, I think that every coach to a certain degree, if they want to win, will have to use it, whether it's selectively or they use it and abuse it as much as possible. That depends. Mike Norvell is to one extreme. Like Marcus said, Marquishimo, if not for Deion Sanders, it would be Mike Norvell who would have, the transfer portal banner. Florida State has rebuilt their entire roster and program through the portal. Their high school recruiting still, outside of this season, under Norvell has been a far cry from what Florida State recruiting used to be under Jimbo Fisher. Now, with commitments from guys like KJ Bolden, for example, 5-star safety out of Georgia, everything's beginning to ramp up. And there's also Landon Thomas, a 5-star tight end who's also from Georgia, I believe, who's a part of this recruiting class for Florida State as well. The Seminoles had 311 offensive yards. They had 4 total touchdowns. And the run game needs work. Florida State builds this team and this offense off of the run game. And by run game, I don't just mean the offense, but the rush defense. They allowed Clemson to rush for 146 yards, and they haven't faced, in truth, an offense that is great at running the football yet. I don't think Clemson is. I think they're good. Maybe they're great. They're certainly not elite at running the football. LSU is another team that way. They don't have a great stable of running backs, and their offensive line has questions. Now, for winning the ACC, their offensive line for Florida State and also defensive line, their trench play in terms of run blocking and also stuffing the run is probably good enough. However, I do know that if you're a Florida State fan or if you're a college football fan even, I know that all of us are a little curious as to how far Florida State can go. And Mike Norvell is going to want to win as many games as he can this season to build more momentum, to maximize your chances of winning games. And also, against Castellanos and Boston College, for example, Florida State's defense struggled against the run, especially at quarterback. It would help the team a lot to maximize their chances of going undefeated or at least securing a college football playoff spot if they can do a better job of stopping the run. But Clemson ran the ball for nearly 40 times, and they didn't allow 150 yards even. So it was an admirable performance. I just think the rush offense and also parts of the run defense can get better. I think they have the potential and the staff to work on that, and I think they will work on that and potentially improve. The wide receiver room is great, but especially Keon Coleman. I think he is an elite wide receiver. And lastly, and this was obvious the moment Cade Klubnik's pass was deflected on 4th and 2 to end the game, Florida State takes a massive lead in the ACC race. Now, obviously, North Carolina's undefeated, and they look much improved compared to last year. This might be Mac Brown's best team that he's ever had with the Tar Heels in his second tenure with the school. Miami, Mario Cristobal has totally turned that program around. I know that could be an overreaction, but Van Dyke looks amazing. The offensive line is great. They have receivers. I've gained back a lot of respect for Mario Cristobal that I lost in 2021 when I thought he wasted the talent of that Oregon team. And I think that might show that for perhaps the whole season, his mind was on the Miami Hurricanes. And why not? He played there. It's obviously been his dream job, and good for him. But we'll have to see, of course, how Miami does for the rest of the year. That's all to say that there are still some contenders that could challenge Florida State, and it's not like Florida State's the only team who's undefeated in conference. But right now, I think it's pretty clear they are the best ACC team, at least on paper. They beat the man being Clemson. Therefore, for now, as Clemson has 2 conference losses already in their first 2 conference games, I think it's safe to say that Florida State right now is the man. Now, that could change very quickly. It is only the month of September. If Clemson wins out and also Florida State wins out, Clemson most likely is in the ACC championship game, matching up against Florida State once again. So there's a lot of, game results and tiebreakers and rules that we'll have to sift through, along with, of course, 8 games left for all of the ACC teams. We'll have to sift through all of those before we know for sure who wins the ACC. We have to play the games. Not everything's on paper. Otherwise, the preseason would determine everything. But Florida State right now, from a momentum standpoint, on the field standpoint, and a strength of record standpoint, they're in the lead right now in the ACC. And that's awesome if you're a Florida State fan. So the Seminoles win 31-24 in overtime over the Clemson Tigers, who have ruled the ACC with an iron fist since 2015. Will Florida State retake the conference and have their own dynasty? We'll just have to see. In fact, their future with the ACC is currently up in the air, at least for the long-term future, because of the grant of rights deal. But that's a conversation for another day and another video. Thank you to my Patreon supporters for, helping this channel out and helping me to produce more content, quality content. I think in my mind, we have one of the best college football communities on YouTube, and I'm trying my hardest to make it the best college football community on YouTube. And your support, it's always appreciated. It's absolutely never expected. There is extra content specifically relating to a power rankings system that I'm trying to develop that is being showcased on Patreon. So along with supporting me and getting shouted out at the end of these videos, if you want to get access to some extra content, consider checking the link down in the description below and joining our Patreon community. Thank you to Spencer Bringhurst and Will Loftus, Gabriel Calendar, Roaming Gnome, and Matthew Sale for supporting the channel. And thank you all for watching. Make sure to subscribe, like the video, and comment your thoughts down below on this matchup. Have a great day, guys.